There is a version of Australian history that gets taught in schools, printed in textbooks, and repeated in documentary after documentary. It is a tidy story. Convicts arrived, settlers followed, gold was discovered, squatters took land, a federation was formed. And out of all that effort and hardship, a handful of families rose to the top. They worked hard, they were clever with money, they were in the right place at the right time. That is the official version. But there is another version, one that sits in the gaps between official records, in the footnotes nobody reads, in the land grant documents that researchers rarely request, in the shipping manifests that arrive before the records were supposed to begin. That version is harder to find. It asks different questions. Not how did these families succeed, but where did they come from? Not what did they build, but what were they building on top of? Not who do they say they were, but who were they before the story starts? If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time is it. Because the story of Australia's wealthiest families in the 1800s is not a story about hard work and luck. It is a story about something arriving before it should have. Something being in place before the official record begins. Something that no historian has ever been able to cleanly explain, and most haven't tried. Tonight we are going to try. We are going to follow the money, the land, the names, and the silences all the way back to the beginning. And what we find at the beginning is not what you were told. Pull the covers up, let the room go dark, and listen carefully, because what you are about to hear has been sitting in plain sight for over 2 centuries, waiting for someone to read all of it in the same room at the same time. Let's start with a question that should have a simple answer but doesn't. Who was the first wealthy person in Australia? Not the first governor, not the first free settler, not the first gold rush millionaire. The first genuinely wealthy person. The first person who had enough accumulated capital, enough land, enough livestock, enough social standing that they could be described, even informally, as rich. Who was that person? And more importantly, when did they become wealthy? If you ask most Australians this question, they will say something about the MacArthurs, John MacArthur, the wool pioneer, the man who is credited with establishing the Australian wool industry, who fought with governors, who was sent back to England multiple times, who somehow always returned more powerful than when he left. The MacArthur family is the go-to answer. They are the founding dynasty. But here is the problem with that answer. By the time John MacArthur is being described as a powerful man in the historical record, he already has everything. The land is already there, the sheep are already there, the connections are already there, the money is already flowing. When you look at how quickly all of that materialized, when you track the dates against what should have been possible given what was available in the colony at that time, something stops making sense. John MacArthur arrived in New South Wales in 1790. He was a soldier, a lieutenant. He had no inherited wealth. He had no merchant family backing him. He had no known patron who could have transferred large sums of capital to him in those first years. And yet, within a decade, he is operating at a scale that should have taken generations to reach. He is acquiring land at a rate that suggests he already knew what the land would be worth before anyone else in the colony understood that it would have value. He is establishing breeding programs for merino sheep that require specific knowledge, specific animals, and specific infrastructure that did not simply appear in the Australian bush. He is corresponding with powerful figures in England, as if he already has relationships with them that predate his colonial service, as if the colony is not a beginning for him, but a continuation. By 801, he has about 4,000 acres and over 1,000 sheep. For context, the entire colonial economy was barely functioning at that point. The free settlers who came after him and worked genuinely hard for years couldn't get anywhere near those numbers. And MacArthur is sitting there in the middle of what is supposed to be a struggling penal colony with a working agricultural estate that already looks like something from an established English countryside. Where did the money come from? Where did the specific expertise come from? Where did the connections come from? The official history waves its hand at these questions and moves on to the drama of his fights with Governor Bligh, because the fights are interesting and the origin is complicated, but the origin is the part that matters. Now, let's talk about something that the MacArthur story glosses over almost entirely. The ships, not the First Fleet. Everyone knows about the First Fleet. 11 ships, 1788. Botany Bay, the famous arrival. That story is told everywhere, but there were other ships that came earlier than they should have. Ships that carried things that a new penal colony had no official reason to possess. Ships that moved between Sydney Cove and ports in Asia, in South America, in the Pacific Islands, in ways that the colonial administration supposedly did not authorize and definitely did not fully document. By the mid-1790s, there was already a flourishing, if technically illegal, trade network operating out of Port Jackson. Whale oil, sealskins, timber, and grain were moving. In the other direction came rum, cloth, tools, and in some accounts currency that had no business being in a place that was still officially operating on ration tickets and grain allotments. The people running this trade were not the governors. The governors were often the last to know and frequently powerless to stop it when they found out. The people running this trade were officers, sometimes merchants who arrived on ships and didn't leave, sometimes men with unclear titles and unclear origins who seemed to have contacts everywhere and accountability to nobody. This network is sometimes called the Rum Corps, and while that name has stuck in popular history mainly because of the dramatic image of soldiers overthrowing a governor over alcohol, the actual scope of what the Rum Corps was doing is far more interesting than rum. They were establishing a private commercial infrastructure in a place that was supposed to be a government operation. They were creating financial systems, they were accumulating land, they were doing all of this faster than should have been possible, and with a sophistication that suggests they arrived knowing exactly what they were going to do before they got there. John MacArthur was connected to these networks. So were several other men who would go on to become the founding figures of colonial Australian wealth. And the question that history skips over is this: did these men find the opportunity in the colony, or did they bring the opportunity with them? Because there is a difference. A man who arrives and discovers an opportunity is a story about talent and timing. A man who arrives with a pre-formed plan, with capital already identified, with networks already established, with knowledge about what the land will be worth before anyone else knows it's valuable. That is a different kind of story. That is a story about preparation, about foreknowledge, about interests that were operating at a level above individual ambition. Let's move to another family that appears in the founding mythology of Australian wealth, the Wentworths. William Charles Wentworth is one of those figures who looms so large in Australian political and colonial history that the actual details of his rise get obscured by the legend. He is celebrated as the man who explored the Blue Mountains, who helped push for self-governance, who championed the rights of the free settlers against the Crown's control. The statue-worthy version, the version that gets taught in schools. But Darcy Wentworth, his father, is the more interesting case. Darcy Wentworth arrived in New South Wales in 1790, the same ship as John MacArthur, which is already a detail worth pausing on. He came as a surgeon's assistant after being acquitted of highway robbery charges in England. Charges that were brought multiple times and multiple times resulted in either acquittal or discharge. He arrived with no official fortune. He had no documented merchant house behind him. And yet within a few years, Darcy Wentworth is one of the most powerful men in the colony. He becomes the principal surgeon. He runs the hospital as a private monopoly alongside two associates under an arrangement so favorable to himself that it reads less like a colonial appointment and more like a sweetheart deal that was negotiated before he ever set foot in Australia. He is granted land, he acquires livestock, he builds a house that contemporary accounts describe as among the finest in the colony, at a time when fine houses simply did not exist. He is lending money, which means he has money to lend, which means he arrived with capital or acquired it at a rate that defies the official record of a colonial surgeon's income. Where did the money come from? The official answer, to the extent there is one, involves a mixture of his medical salary, his private agricultural work, and some reference to the hospital monopoly arrangement. But when you actually do the arithmetic, when you look at what a surgeon's assistant was paid, what the land cost to develop, what the livestock cost to acquire, what the building materials for a fine colonial house would have run in a place where everything had to be shipped in or laboriously produced, the numbers do not add up, not even close. Darcy Wentworth died in 1827 and left an estate that his son William Charles used as the foundation for what became one of the most powerful fortunes in 19th century Australia. William Charles himself went on to accumulate over 100,000 acres of land at the peak of the squatting era. He purchased vast tracts that were still being officially opened for settlement, while he was already there, already running stock, already treating the land as if he owned it before the paperwork confirmed that he did. And this is a pattern you see repeatedly in the founding stories of Australian colonial wealth. The wealth arrives or materializes just slightly before the official mechanism that should have created it. The land is there before the grant. The sheep are there before the breed could have been established. The money is there before the income stream that supposedly generated it. Just slightly, just enough that a casual reader glosses over it. But it is consistent. It is consistent across family after family, generation after generation, story after story. Let's talk about land, because in colonial Australia, land is everything. It is the foundation of every fortune. It is the mechanism of every dynasty. And the story of how the land got distributed in the first 50 years of colonial settlement is one of the most consequential and least examined stories in Australian history. The official system worked like this. The Crown owned all land in Australia. It was technically terra nullius, empty land, a legal fiction that ignored the presence of Aboriginal Australians who had been living on and managing that land for tens of thousands of years. Under the colonial administration, land could be granted by the governor to settlers who applied for it, who had the means to work it, and who met criteria that shifted constantly depending on who was in power and who they were friends with. This system should have produced a slow, rational distribution of land tied to the demonstrated capacity of settlers to use it productively. That is what the system was supposed to do. What it actually produced was something very different. By the 1820s and 1830s, before most of the interior of New South Wales was even mapped by Europeans, certain families had already established a claim, informal but powerful, to enormous tracts of territory. They were squatters, technically, operating on Crown land without a lease or formal grant, moving their sheep and cattle into country that hadn't been officially opened for settlement, and the government was supposed to stop them. The government failed repeatedly and eventually gave up and began formalizing the squatters' claims instead. But here is what gets glossed over in the standard account of the squatting era. The squatters who were most successful, who ended up holding the most land, who built the most durable dynasties, were not random adventurers who stumbled west ahead of the surveys. Many of them had information. They knew where the good water was. They knew which country would support large flocks. They knew which runs, when formally surveyed, would be found to contain the most reliable pasture. They moved into exactly those areas while rival squatters, often more experienced bushmen with just as much drive and just as much courage, moved into country that turned out to be marginal. You can explain some of this as superior judgment. You can explain some of it as better access to the Aboriginal guides who knew the country. But you cannot explain all of it that way because the pattern is too consistent and the advantage is too specific. The families that came out of the squatting era with the largest holdings, the MacArthurs, the Wentworths, the Leslies, the Blackneys, the Larnaches, the Gilchrists, the Faithfuls, a dozen others, repeatedly ended up on the best country, not the second best country, not good country with some problems, the genuinely exceptional country, again and again. And a number of these families had a common thread. They had connections to a network of men who had been in the colony since the earliest years. Men who had been part of the officer class, the merchant class, the people who ran the rum corps or had dealings with it. Men who understood the interior of the colony not from surveys, because official surveys hadn't been done, but from some other source of knowledge. What was that source? This is where the history gets very quiet. There is a body of evidence, fragmentary but persistent, that suggests a small number of men had been moving through the Australian interior well before the official exploration narratives began. Not formal expeditions with documented routes and government backing, quiet movement, informal parties. Men who went out and came back and didn't write reports. Men who had reasons to know the country that couldn't be officially acknowledged because the movement itself was unauthorized or because the knowledge came from sources that couldn't be cited. Aboriginal testimony is part of this. There are accounts recorded much later by anthropologists and historians who were interviewing Aboriginal elders in the late 19th and early 20th centuries of European men appearing in interior regions of New South Wales and Victoria decades before the official explorers were supposed to have gotten there. Not in large parties, alone or in pairs, moving quietly, sometimes trading, sometimes just watching, and then disappearing back the way they came. These accounts were largely dismissed by colonial historians as confused or embellished. The idea that there was systematic unauthorized movement through the interior before the official exploration era didn't fit the narrative of brave discoverers pushing into unknown country. But if you set aside the narrative for a moment and just look at the behavior of certain families during the squatting era, the possibility becomes harder to dismiss. because someone knew where the good country was. Someone had information that shouldn't have existed, and that someone was not guessing. Now let's go further back, much further back, because there is a question that underlies everything we've been discussing, and it is a question that Australian history almost never asks directly. It simply assumes the answer. The question is this: when did Europeans first arrive in Australia? The official answer is 1770, when James Cook charted the eastern coast, and then 1788, when the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay. Those are the dates, those are the facts, that is the beginning. Except there is a substantial and growing body of evidence that suggests the beginning was earlier. Much earlier, not by a few years, by centuries. The Portuguese were mapping the world aggressively in the late 1400s and early 1500s. Their navigational achievements were extraordinary, and their secrecy about those achievements was equally extraordinary. The Portuguese operated under something called the Padrão Real, a policy of deliberate suppression of geographic information that was strategically valuable. Charts showing new coastlines were classified. Navigators who talked about what they had found were punished, sometimes fatally. The Portuguese understood that geographic knowledge was commercial power, and they protected it accordingly. There are maps. This is not fringe territory. These are documents that are in archives that have been studied by academic historians that are acknowledged to exist. The Dieppe maps, a series of French cartographic documents from the 1540s, include a representation of a great southern landmass labeled Javila Grande. The shape, when corrected for the cartographic distortions of the period and oriented correctly, corresponds surprisingly well to the eastern coastline of Australia. Not perfectly. These are 16th century maps, but well enough that serious historians have spent careers arguing about what the Dieppe cartographers were working from. The most parsimonious explanation is that they were working from Portuguese charts of coastlines that Portuguese ships had encountered somewhere in the southern hemisphere, charts that the Portuguese had made, classified, and which had somehow leaked into French cartographic hands, as these things sometimes did in a world of competitive maritime intelligence gathering. If Portuguese ships were charting Australian coastlines in the early 1500s, what else were they doing? Were they stopping? Were they making contact? Were they leaving things behind? There are physical artifacts that suggest the answer might be yes. The Mahogany ship, a reported wreck of a vessel whose timber was identified by witnesses as mahogany or cedar rather than any timber species used by English or Dutch shipwrights, was sighted multiple times in the sand dunes near Warrnambool Bull in Victoria between the 1830s and 1880s. Witnesses described a vessel of foreign design, partially buried, old enough to have been there for a very long time. The ship was eventually buried completely by shifting dunes and has never been recovered, but the descriptions from multiple independent witnesses are consistent enough that many maritime historians take them seriously. And mahogany was not a timber used by any European power with documented pre-1788 contact with Australia. It was used historically by Portuguese and Spanish shipwrights. There is also the story of the Gympie Pyramid in Queensland, a stepped stone structure in the hinterland north of Brisbane, similar in construction to some Polynesian and Southeast Asian stone platforms, dismissed by mainstream archaeology as a farm wall built by settlers, except the settlers who supposedly built it had no reason to build it in that shape, and the stones are fitted together in ways that settler dry stone walling simply did not do. And the local Aboriginal people, the Gubbi Gubbi, had oral traditions about a place of the old ones in that area that predated their own occupation of the territory, which is an extraordinary thing for any Aboriginal tradition to claim. None of this proves a pre-1788 European presence in Australia that was organised enough to leave lasting infrastructure, but it establishes something important. The coast of Australia was not unknown to the world before 1788. It was known, it was visited, at least in parts, and the knowledge of it was held by people who had strong reasons to keep it quiet. Now, here is where this connects back to the families. If there was pre-existing knowledge of Australia circulating in certain European commercial and maritime circles before 1788, who had access to that knowledge? Not the general public, not the ordinary settler or soldier who ended up on the transport ships of the First Fleet. The knowledge would have been held by the powerful, by merchants, by naval officers of senior rank, by men with connections to the trading houses and exploration networks that had been accumulating geographic intelligence about the Pacific for 200 years before Cook made his voyage official. And who do we find very shortly after 1788? Moving faster than they should have been able to move, knowing more than they should have known, positioned precisely where they needed to be in order to take maximum advantage of a colonial economy that most of their contemporaries were still trying to understand. The families. Let's talk about wool for a while. Specifically, let's talk about merino sheep, because the merino story is one of the most interesting economic mysteries in the whole colonial period, and it is almost never discussed in those terms. Merino sheep were, in the late 18th century, one of the most tightly controlled agricultural commodities in the world. Spain had a monopoly. The breed had been cultivated in Spain for centuries and produced wool of a fineness that no other breed could match. The Spanish crown, understanding exactly what this meant economically, had made it essentially illegal to export merino sheep. You could not simply purchase a merino ram and ship it to the other side of the world. That was not a transaction that happened in the open market. The Spanish maintained the monopoly with considerable seriousness, and breaking it required either a high-level diplomatic negotiation or connections that operated outside of diplomatic channels. By the early 1800s, John MacArthur had merino sheep, not just a few curiosities, breeding stock, animals of sufficient quality that the wool they produced was being assessed by English manufacturers as superior to most of what was coming out of Spain itself at that point. The question of how MacArthur got those animals has never been satisfactorily answered. The official account mentions a partial consignment that came via the Cape of Good Hope, some animals that came through a connection to King George's own flock at Kew, some that may have come through Spanish sources that are vaguely described as contacts. But here's the problem. Even if you accept all of those accounts as accurate, merinos still don't breed up to a competitive flock size in the time frame that MacArthur was operating. You need many generations of selective breeding to establish a quality flock. You need expertise in that breeding that doesn't come from reading pamphlets. You need someone who already knows what they're doing to be managing the animals from the beginning, because mistakes in early generations set back the breeding program by years. MacArthur's flock achieved commercial quality too fast. It achieved it faster than the documented acquisition of animals allows for, which means either he had animals earlier than the record shows, or he had expertise earlier than the record shows, or both. His time in England between 1801 and 1805, when he was supposed to be facing a court-martial for fighting a duel with his commanding officer, is also interesting. He managed to get the court-martial charges dropped, which itself speaks to the level of his connections in London at that time. A soldier facing a dual charge did not simply have court-martial proceedings set aside unless someone of very significant influence was intervening, and while he was in England, he was able to access the Kew flock, to meet with breeders, to ship animals back to New South Wales. He returned with everything he needed to continue building an operation that should have been impossible. Who was MacArthur's patron in England? The histories wave at this vaguely. They mention his connections to the wool merchants of the city, to certain members of the Board of Trade, to people who had interests in what colonial Australia might produce commercially. But they never name a principle. They never identify the organizing interest that was backing MacArthur's position in the colony from the beginning, that was protecting him through his various clashes with successive governors, that was ensuring that no matter what dramatic thing he did in the colony, the outcome always left him with more land, more sheep, and more power, because that interest was clearly there. You cannot read the record of MacArthur's life in Australia without concluding that he had protection that went beyond anything he could have arranged for himself. He fought with Philip Gidley King. He fought with William Bligh. He fought with Lachlan Macquarie. He won, or at least survived, without meaningful penalty every single time. Bligh, who was not a man who backed down easily, as his history with the Bounty mutineers demonstrated, was literally deposed by the Rum Corps in the only successful coup against British colonial authority in Australian history. And the aftermath of that coup resulted in the coup participants being essentially pardoned. It resulted in MacArthur being recognized as a legitimate colonial presence with legitimate claims on the land and the animals he had accumulated. Someone made that happen, and that someone was not operating at the level of a colonial officer making good commercial decisions. That was operating at the level of imperial policy. The men who moved into the wool industry behind MacArthur, the families who took his model and scaled it across the interior in the decades that followed, had similar profiles. They arrived with more than they should have had. Their operations scaled faster than the documented resources allow. And they had connections to London houses, to banking institutions, to political figures in both the colonial administration and the British Parliament that seemed disproportionate to their stated origins. The MacArthur family would eventually control Camden Park, a property of extraordinary scale and quality. The Wentworths would control Vaucluse and vast pastoral runs in the interior. The Leslies would run sheep across enormous tracts of Queensland before Queensland was even formally separated from New South Wales. The Faithfuls would control the Monaro Plains. The Blackneys and the Gilchrists and a dozen other names would, between them, hold more land than many European principalities. All of it acquired in a period of less than 50 years. All of it built on a foundation whose origins are blurred just enough that the question of where it came from becomes difficult to answer precisely. And that blurring is not an accident of poor record keeping. Colonial Australia kept better records than you might expect. Governors were meticulous. The Colonial Office in London required detailed reports. Ship manifests were maintained. Land grant applications were documented. The gaps in the record are specific. They are concentrated around the early accumulation phase of the families that ended up on top. The record starts to get clear right around the time those families have already established themselves, and it stays clear from that point forward. It is the foundation that is obscured. And foundations, in my experience of reading history, are not obscured randomly. There is a network that kept appearing in the background of colonial Australian commercial life in the first 50 years of settlement. It did not have a formal name. It did not announce its existence. You cannot point to a single document that proves it operated as a coordinated entity, but you can trace it by following the connections between the men who were involved in it. It centered on a small group of officer merchants who had arrived in the colony in the earliest years. It extended through a set of commercial relationships in London, particularly among trading houses that had existing Pacific interests. And it manifested in a series of patterns of land acquisition, patterns of who had access to capital when capital was supposed to be extremely scarce, patterns of who had advanced knowledge of policy changes, of which land would be opened next, of which colonial administrators were about to be replaced, and by whom. To illustrate what I mean, consider the timing of pastoral expansion in New South Wales. The Blue Mountains were not officially crossed until 1813, when the Blaxland, Lawson, Wentworth expedition made it through. That is the official narrative. The country on the other side, the Great Western Plains, was not known to Europeans before that date, officially, and yet, within months of that crossing, there were settlers already moving cattle into the country immediately west of the mountains. Within a couple of years, there were squatters established far enough west that they could not possibly have moved that fast if the crossing of 1813 was truly the first time Europeans had identified a route through. The Western expansion proceeded with a speed that makes sense only if some of the parties involved already knew what they were going to find. They moved like people who had a destination in mind, not like people who were exploring. They knew where the water was, they knew where the grass was, they moved directly to it, and then when the formal land administration caught up with where they already were, they got their grants confirmed. This happened again in the expansion toward the Darling River in the 1820s and 1830s. It happened again in the movement into the Port Phillip district, which would become Victoria in the mid-1830s. Each time the pattern was the same. A small number of well-connected squatters were already in the best country when the official settlement wave arrived. They had moved faster than the documented knowledge of the country should have allowed, and they came out of the process as the largest landholders. John Batman, who made his famous treaty with the Wurundjeri people for the Port Phillip district in 1835, is often presented as a bold, independent pioneer, and there are aspects of his character that support that narrative. He was physically brave, experienced in the bush, willing to take enormous personal risks. But Batman did not simply wander south from New South Wales on a hunch. He was backed by the Port Phillip Association, a group of Launceston merchants who had been planning a settlement in the Port Phillip district for years before Batman made his crossing. The association had members with deep connections to the Sydney merchant class, to the wool industry, to the trading networks that had been operating since the earliest years of the colony. The Port Phillip Association knew the district had commercial potential before they sent anyone to look at it. Not from official surveys, because there weren't any, from some other source. From traders who had been up and down the southern coast, from whalers and sealers who had been working Bass Strait for decades and knew the land from the sea, from information that circulated in certain circles without ever being formalized. Batman's treaty was declared illegal by Governor Bourke in Sydney. The Crown would not recognise private purchase of land from Aboriginal people, but the families and their associates who had backed Batman's venture ended up with enormous holdings in the Port Phillip district anyway. The mechanism changed. Instead of a private purchase, it became squatting runs and then formal pastoral leases. But the outcome was the same. The people who had been positioned to move first, who had the foreknowledge and the capital to act on it, ended up with the land. And now we have to talk about money because none of this happened for free. Pastoral expansion required capital. It required livestock to stock the runs. It required workers, shepherds, stockmen, fencers. It required supplies. It required the ability to sustain an operation for years before it became profitable, because wool growing was not an industry with instant returns. You had to build the flock, shear it, ship the wool to London, wait for the sale, receive the proceeds, and survive on credit in the meantime. This credit came from somewhere. In the colonial period, it came overwhelmingly from a set of banks and commercial houses, the majority of them based in London, some in Sydney, that were providing pastoral finance on terms that were extremely favorable to certain borrowers and much less favorable to others. Understanding who had access to the good credit, on what terms, and through what connections tells you almost as much as the land records about who the network actually was. The Bank of New South Wales, established in 1817, was the first bank in Australia. Its founding shareholders were a remarkably concentrated group. Governor Macquarie supported its establishment. The initial capital came largely from men who were already in the colonial officer merchant class, and its lending in the first decades of its operation was heavily concentrated in exactly the families and the pastoral interests that were building the great colonial fortunes. This is not unusual for a new bank in a new colony. Of course, the bank would lend to the people it knew, to the people who were already operating successfully. That is how banking has always worked, but what it means is that the families who had capital first, who had established themselves in the first 25 years of the colony, were the ones who had access to the institutional credit that allowed them to scale in the squatting era. And the people who arrived later, who had just as much ambition but who hadn't been part of the original network, found themselves either working for the established families or struggling to access credit on the terms they needed. The compounding advantage of early capital in a colony that was expanding rapidly into productive pastoral country was enormous, and it was deliberately maintained. Let's talk about the gold rush, because the gold rush of the 1850s is the moment when Australian economic history supposedly gets democratized, when the diggers come from everywhere, when fortunes are made by ordinary men, when the old colonial aristocracy is supposedly overwhelmed by the sheer chaotic energy of the rush. That is the popular image. And it is partly true. The gold rush did bring an enormous influx of people and capital. It did disrupt some of the old social hierarchies. It did create genuinely new fortunes for people who had arrived with nothing. But look at who came out of the gold rush era owning the most. Look at who profited most durably, and you find the same names again. The families who had been there from the beginning, who had the capital and the infrastructure and the connections, did not get swept away by the gold rush. They positioned themselves to profit from it. The most obvious way was simple commerce. A digger needs food, equipment, shelter, transport. The people who sold those things to the diggers often made more money, more reliably, than the diggers themselves, and the people who supplied the suppliers, who financed the shipping of goods from Melbourne and Sydney and London to the goldfields, who owned the warehouses and the stores, were overwhelmingly from the established commercial class. The gold rush was, among other things, an enormous transfer of capital from the diggers to the merchants. And the merchants were, by and large, the same people or the successors of the same people who had been running the colonial economy since the beginning. There is also the question of alluvial gold in banking. Diggers who struck it moderately rich needed somewhere to put their gold. They needed it assayed, weighed, converted into currency or credit they could use. The institutions that provided this service charged for it, and the institutions were controlled by the established colonial commercial class. Every ounce of gold that went through a colonial bank or gold exchange enriched, to some degree, the shareholders of those institutions. But the deepest and most lasting advantage that the established families had in the gold rush era was in land. The goldfields of Victoria were on land that was technically Crown land, but that land was surrounded by pastoral runs that were in private hands. As the rush expanded and the diggers moved from one field to the next, as towns sprang up and required food and timber and horses, the value of pastoral land in the vicinity of the goldfields went up sharply. The families who owned those runs got richer without doing anything except being there. And then there is the story of what happened to the goldfields themselves after the alluvial gold ran out. Alluvial gold, the stuff that could be found in creek beds and shallow workings, was accessible to individual diggers with modest equipment. But reef gold, gold locked in quartz veins deep underground, required machinery, capital, and organization to extract. As the easy gold was exhausted, the goldfields transitioned from an individual enterprise to a corporate one, and the capital for the corporations that took over the Victorian and New South Wales goldfields came overwhelmingly from London, from the same commercial and banking houses that had been financing Australian pastoral expansion for decades. The same networks, doing the same thing they had always done, which was finding a way to translate the productive potential of the Australian continent into financial returns for interests based 10,000 miles away. Now, let's talk about a family that is less famous in the popular telling, but whose story illuminates the whole dynamic in a particularly stark way: the Durracks. Patrick Durack arrived in Australia from County Clare in Ireland in 1853, during the gold rush period. He had no money of significance. He was part of the wave of emigrants who came seeking an escape from post-famine poverty and the possibility of a new life. He went to the goldfields and he didn't make a fortune there, but he did make enough to buy some sheep. And then he made more. And then his son Michael, who is sometimes called Patsy, took what his father had built and did something extraordinary with it. The Durack story in its official version is a straightforward tale of determination and frontier enterprise. Patsy Durack in the 1880s drove cattle overland from Queensland to the Kimberley region of what is now Western Australia, one of the longest cattle drives in Australian history, establishing the family's pastoral empire in the northwest. The journey was grueling, it was dangerous, it took years, and the Durack cattle stations in the Kimberley became some of the largest in Australia. What the official version does not dwell on is the question of how the Duracks, who were genuinely not from the established colonial elite, managed to secure the kind of backing needed to finance an operation at that scale. The cattle drive to the Kimberley was not a personal adventure. It was a commercial venture that required investors, that required connections to the Colonial Land Administration, that required someone in power to look favorably on the Durack applications for Kimberley leases when those leases became available. The Duraks had managed, in the generation between Patrick's arrival in 1853 and Patsy's Kimberley venture in the 1880s, to build relationships with the pastoral establishment in Queensland, to connect into the networks that were extending Australian pastoral enterprise northward and westward into the last great pastoral frontiers. And those connections, which are not fully documented in the public record, but whose effects are visible in the outcomes, were what made the Kimberley venture possible. The Durack story is in some ways the most interesting case in colonial Australian wealth formation, precisely because the Duraks were not from the original network. They were newcomers who learned to navigate the existing system, who identified who the relevant gatekeepers were and built relationships with them, who understood that frontier pastoral enterprise in colonial Australia was never purely a matter of individual initiative. It was always also a matter of access. Access to capital, to land, to political favor, to the networks of information and protection that determined who succeeded and who didn't in the expansion of the Australian pastoral frontier. What the Durack story shows, when you read it carefully, is that the system itself was the thing. Not any one family, not any one set of connections. The system for translating Australian land into wealth was established in the earliest years of the colony, and it was structured in such a way that the people who understood how it worked and who had access to it could leverage it enormously. The people who didn't, no matter how hard they worked or how capable they were working in a different game. Let me tell you about something that mainstream Australian history almost entirely ignores, and that is the question of what the Aboriginal Australians knew, what they held, and what was taken from them in the process of this wealth creation. Not in the abstract moral sense, which is discussed at length in contemporary Australian politics and culture, but in the specific economic sense. In the sense of what the pastoral dynasties were actually built on, physically, materially, and in terms of knowledge. The country that became the great pastoral runs of New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, and later Western Australia and the Northern Territory was not terra nullius, it was not empty, it was actively managed. The Aboriginal Australians who lived across this country had, over tens of thousands of years, developed detailed and sophisticated systems for managing landscapes for maximum productivity. They burned country systematically to encourage the growth of grasses that attracted and sustained large animal populations. They managed water sources, fish traps, eel traps, irrigation systems of remarkable complexity. They knew the seasonal movements of every significant animal species across their territories. They knew which plant species grew in which soil types under which conditions. They knew the country in a depth and detail that no European settler, however observant, could match without decades of local experience. And the squatters knew that they knew it. The most successful early squatters were not the ones who were brilliant at reading a landscape from a European agricultural perspective. They were the ones who were best at extracting knowledge from Aboriginal people, who could establish relationships with local Aboriginal groups, whether through trade or through the employment of Aboriginal men as stockmen and trackers, that gave them access to the accumulated ecological intelligence of the country. This is explicitly documented in many of the journals and accounts of early squatters, though it is rarely foregrounded in the histories. The references are there, almost matter of fact. We were shown the permanent water by the blackfellows. A native tracker found the track that led us to the good grass. Our native employees knew every water hole in the country, and we couldn't have managed without them. These acknowledgements appear throughout the records, and then they disappear from the later retellings because the later narrative needed the pastoralists to be heroic individuals conquering a wild country, not men who were extracting value from the indigenous inhabitants of that country with various degrees of coercion. But the knowledge transfer was not just about finding water and grass, it went deeper than that. The Aboriginal land management systems, particularly the burning practices, had over millennia created landscapes that were extraordinarily productive for large grazing animals. The open grasslands that the squatters found across the inland plains of eastern Australia, landscapes that their sheep and cattle could exploit directly, were not natural ecosystems in any uncomplicated sense. They were the product of thousands of years of deliberate fire management. They were effectively farmed country. The squatters were inheriting the output of a long-running agricultural system. They simply replaced the previous managers without compensation, acknowledgement, or even, in most cases, apparent awareness. The pastoral fortunes of colonial Australia were built on a foundation of dispossession, ecological knowledge transfer, and free labor, not just in the abstract sense that all colonial wealth involves some degree of extraction from colonized people, but in the specific concrete sense that the pastoral runs could not have been established without the active participation, willing or coerced, of Aboriginal Australians who knew the country and whose knowledge made the whole enterprise viable. This is not separate from the story of the mysterious early wealth of colonial families. It is central to it, because one of the things that the original network of officer merchants understood, one of the things that they positioned themselves to benefit from, was precisely this. They understood that Australia contained productive land. They understood it because, I would argue, they had information about it. And that information was generated in part by contact before 1788, before the official beginning with the Aboriginal people who were already there. The question of what kind of contact and what was exchanged in it is one that historians rarely ask, because to ask it is to threaten the foundational narrative of the colony. It is to suggest that the beginning was not what we were told it was, that the knowledge the early families had, the knowledge that let them move so fast and accumulate so much, had a source that is not acknowledged in any official account. That source, I believe, was Aboriginal, not directly in all cases, not through formal transactions, but through a chain of information moving through whalers and sealers and informal traders and men who had been in the southern hemisphere longer than the record shows, that eventually reached the ears of the people who would become the colonial dynasties. It is a strange thought that the wealth of the great Australian pastoral families, held up as the product of European enterprise and colonial initiative, was in its deepest foundation derived from the oldest source of knowledge in the country, from the people who were supposed to know nothing, to have nothing, to be nothing in the economic calculus of the colony. And that this source was concealed not by any deliberate conspiracy, but by the simple operation of a colonial narrative that could not accommodate it. Now let's talk about an aspect of this story that is even less discussed: the connections to the maritime world. The maritime world of the late 18th and early 19th centuries was a global economy in a way that is easy to underestimate from a modern perspective. Ships were moving between Europe, Africa, the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific in quantities and on routes that the public record badly underrepresents. The official logs of officially chartered voyages tell one story. The actual movement of capital, goods, people, and information across the world's oceans in this period was orders of magnitude more complex. Australia sits at the intersection of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Its position, once you understand its geography, is extraordinarily significant for maritime trade. It is within reach of the Spice Islands of eastern Indonesia, of the Asian trade routes that ran from China and Japan through Southeast Asia and into the Indian Ocean. It is within reach of the great Pacific Island groups of South America's western coast, and its own resources, once understood, were deeply attractive. Timber for ship construction and repair, fresh water, food, seals and whales in the surrounding seas. Before 1788, these resources were already being used. The Dutch had charted much of the western and southern Australian coastline in the 17th century. Dutch ships heading from the Cape of Good Hope to Batavia, the colonial capital of what is now Indonesia, would run east with the roaring 40s wind and then turn north toward Java. And in this process, they frequently encountered or came close to the Australian coast. Several Dutch ships actually wrecked on the West Australian coast, and those wrecks produced some of the most disturbing stories in early Australian contact history. Stories of survivors, of small groups of Europeans stranded on or near the Australian coast for extended periods. The Batavia, wrecked on the Abrolhos Islands off the West Australian coast in 1629, is the most famous of these. It is famous for the extraordinary violence of the mutiny that followed the wreck, for the murder of most of the survivors by a small group of conspirators, for the extraordinary rescue journey made by the captain to Batavia to bring back help. But buried in the Batavia story is something that most accounts treat as a footnote. Two of the mutineers were marooned on the Australian mainland by the rescue expedition as punishment, because the captain decided he could not take them all the way to Batavia for trial. They were the first known Europeans to be intentionally left on Australian soil, and nobody knows what happened to them. Two Dutch men in 1629, somewhere on the coast of what would eventually become Western Australia, living, presumably, among the Aboriginal people of that coast. For how long? Forever, presumably, unless they were somehow rescued, and there is no record of a rescue. And if they lived, if they survived the initial period, and were absorbed into the Aboriginal community of the coast, what did they learn? What did they share? What did they leave behind in terms of knowledge and possibly in terms of descendants? This is not a wild speculation. It is a well-documented historical event up to the point of the marooning. What comes after the marooning is undocumented, but the range of possibilities is real. Two European men on the Australian coast in 1629, 159 years before the First Fleet. And this is just the case we know about because it was formally documented as part of the Batavia disaster proceedings. How many cases of informal, undocumented contact, of ships that stopped briefly and left people ashore for various reasons, of sailors who jumped ship, of traders who found their way to the Australian coast through the Indonesian archipelago, were there in the century and a half between the Batavia wreck and the First Fleet? The sealers are a particular case worth examining. The sealing industry in Bass Strait and along the southern Australian coast was operating from the early 1790s, almost immediately after the First Fleet arrived. This is extraordinary if you think about it. The sealing grounds had to be discovered, their location and productivity had to be assessed, the equipment and techniques had to be organized, the trade routes for the products had to be established. All of this happened within a few years of 1788. It happened with a speed that suggests the sealing grounds were not newly discovered. They were already known to at least some of the people who began exploiting them. The early sealers were often men of rough character, operating outside the law, living for months at a time on small islands in Bass Strait, sometimes with Aboriginal women from the Tasmanian coast whom they had taken by force or arrangement. These men knew the southern Australian coast intimately. They knew it from the sea. They knew where there was fresh water, where there was safe anchorage, what the weather did in different seasons, where the land was accessible and where it wasn't. And some of them moved between the sealing industry and other parts of the colonial economy. Some of them ended up in the pastoral industry. Some of them had connections to the merchants in Sydney who bought their oil and furs. They were part of the informal information network of the early colony. They were people who knew things that the official record did not capture. And some of what they knew was about the Australian interior, not from having been there themselves, but from what the Aboriginal women they lived with had told them, from what they had picked up in countless conversations on small islands in Bass Strait with people who had connections to the mainland. The informal maritime economy of the early colony has been almost entirely neglected by mainstream Australian history. The focus has always been on the official narrative, on the governors and the convicts and the free settlers and the pastoral pioneers, the whalers and sealers and informal coastal traders who were operating in the background, who knew things that the official record never captured, who were connected to both the formal economy and the Aboriginal communities of the coast. Those people and their knowledge essentially don't appear in the standard history, but they were there, and the knowledge they held circulated in fragments through the networks that eventually became the great colonial fortunes. Let me give you a specific example of the maritime pastoral connection that illustrates what I'm talking about. The pastoral expansion into the Northern Territory in the 1870s and 1880s. This was, even by the standards of the Australian pastoral frontier, extraordinarily rapid. The country north of the Roper River, the country around what is now Darwin and Catherine and Tennant Creek, was being stocked with cattle within a decade of formal European settlement. The people who did this, who moved cattle through country that no European-led expedition had properly surveyed, who established stations in country where the seasonal water was uncertain and the distances from supply were enormous, had to know the country in some way that the official exploration narrative doesn't account for. The Overland Telegraph Line, completed in 1872, gave a partial explanation. The line's construction surveyors had identified routes and water sources, but the pastoral advance went beyond what the telegraph survey could have covered, and it went faster. The people moving cattle into the Northern Territory in the 1870s were doing it with the same preternaturally accurate knowledge of water and grass that characterized the squatting rush in New South Wales half a century earlier. The source of that knowledge, in the Territory case, included the Macassan traders from South Sulawesi, who had been visiting the northern coast of Australia for several hundred years to fish for sea cucumber, called trepang, which was a valuable trade good in Asian markets. The Macassans are a story unto themselves in the history of pre-colonial contact with Australia. They came seasonally, they camped on the northern coast. They had established trading relationships with the Aboriginal peoples of Arnhem Land and the Kimberley coast. They left behind material artifacts, watercraft designs, fishing techniques, crop plants, words that were absorbed into Aboriginal languages. They had been doing this since at least the 17th century and possibly much longer. And crucially, they knew the coast, they knew the rivers, they knew, in general terms, the geography of the northern country that Europeans were going to spend enormous effort pretending to discover in the 19th century. Some of the early Northern Territory pastoralists had connections to the Asian trade networks through which the Macassan Trepang trade operated. Not direct connections necessarily, but indirect ones through the colonial merchants of Singapore and Batavia and Manila, who were the end customers for Macassan products and who knew the Northern Australian coast as a geographic reality long before the colonial administration in Adelaide or Melbourne got around to formally surveying it. There are several families in Australian colonial history whose origins are so obscure that even the most diligent genealogical researchers have hit walls. Not stone walls, where records simply don't exist for a period, but specifically constructed walls where records exist up to a point, end abruptly, and then pick up again in a different form in a different country with a slightly different name or a different stated birthplace or a different account of who their father was. This pattern, which genealogists sometimes call the brick wall ancestor problem, is common enough in ordinary family history that it doesn't immediately raise suspicion. Records were lost, births were unregistered, names were changed on immigration, these things happen. But in Australian colonial history, the brick walls tend to cluster in particular ways. They tend to cluster around the founding generation of the wealthy families, and they tend to appear at the point in the family history that would reveal the origin of the initial capital or the initial land. The Youngs of New South Wales, the Blaxlands, the Campbells, the Simeons, family after family. When you trace them back past the colonial record, past the point at which they appear as established colonial figures, you hit a wall that is specifically located at the moment when their wealth was being assembled. The land grant application doesn't explain the prior accumulation. The prior accumulation doesn't have a documented source. And the English or Irish or Scottish record, when you try to find it, is either missing or it doesn't match what the family claimed about itself in the colony. Some of this is explained by the social pressures of the colonial period. A convict background was shameful. A background involving highway robbery or fraud or other criminal activity was something families worked hard to bury. The colony had a powerful interest in forgetting its origins, and many families participated enthusiastically in that forgetting. But some of the gaps are not about shame, they are about something that doesn't have an obvious explanation, even when you account for the social dynamics. There is a pattern in some of the founding colonial families of a very particular kind of connection to Freemasonry. This is a topic that requires some care because Freemasonry in popular culture has been buried under so many layers of conspiracy theory nonsense that it is difficult to discuss it calmly and accurately. But Freemasonry was, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, a genuine and significant social and commercial network. It was not a secret organization in the sense of having hidden criminal purposes. It was a network of mutual aid and commercial preferment among members, organized through lodges that maintained their own records and their own lines of communication outside of the official structures of state and church. Many of the most significant figures in colonial Australian history were Freemasons. Governor Macquarie was not a Mason, but he was surrounded by men who were. The early banking establishment of New South Wales included prominent Masons. The colonial judiciary, the pastoral establishment, the merchant class, all of these contained men whose lodge connections crossed the formal boundaries of colonial life and created lines of loyalty and communication that the official record doesn't capture. This matters because Freemasonry in this period was not just a social club. It was a mechanism for transmitting certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of trust across distances and across social positions. A man who was a Mason in London had a connection to men who were Masons in Sydney and to men who were Masons in Calcutta or Cape Town or Singapore or Boston. That network of connection was reliable in ways that other networks were not because it was maintained by ritual obligation and by the practical experience that lodge membership meant you could trust a man with certain things. The question I'm raising is this: could the network of early colonial wealth formation, the set of connections that allowed certain families to arrive with advantages that the official record cannot explain, have operated in part through Masonic channels, through a network that existed before the colony was established, that had geographic and commercial intelligence about the Australian continent, that had reasons to see the colonial enterprise succeed, and that positioned its members to benefit from that success? I cannot prove this. I want to be clear about that. I am not saying that a Masonic conspiracy created the wealth of colonial Australia. I am saying that the network that connected certain early colonial families to each other and to interests in London that supported and protected them has the characteristics of the Masonic network. It was consistent, it was reliable, it operated across long distances, it provided protection to members in difficulty, and it was invisible to outsiders in a way that was not accidental. Whether the organizing principle of that network was specifically Masonic, or whether it was a commercial network that overlapped significantly with Masonic membership, or whether it was something else entirely that simply had similar structural characteristics, I don't know. But the network was there. The effects of it are documented, and the failure of mainstream Australian history to name it or describe it is itself a datum. There is another thread in this story that I want to pick up, and it takes us in a direction that might seem unexpected. It takes us to China. The Chinese community in colonial Australia is usually discussed in the context of the gold rush, which is when large numbers of Chinese immigrants arrived and when the anti-Chinese sentiment that would eventually culminate in the White Australia policy became politically significant. But there were Chinese in Australia before the gold rush: merchants, sailors, cooks, gardeners, a small community that operated in the interstices of the colonial economy. And some of those Chinese had connections that were older than the colony itself. The maritime trade routes that ran through Southeast Asia and down into the Pacific had been operating for centuries. Chinese merchants from Guangdong and Fujian had been trading through the Indonesian archipelago for a very long time. They knew the geography of the region. They knew, in some cases, the geography of the northern Australian coast through the same Macassan trade networks that connected northern Australia to the broader Southeast Asian commercial world. And some of the Chinese merchants who arrived in the colony in its early years did not arrive in ignorance of what Australia was. They arrived with knowledge. What does this mean for the founding dynasties? It means that the commercial network that those dynasties were connected to was more international, more deeply rooted in pre-colonial Pacific and Asian trade than the official story acknowledges. The great pastoral fortunes were built on Australian land and Australian wool. But the commercial intelligence that made it possible to accumulate that land and that wool so quickly, to know where to go and what to do before anyone else did, came from a global maritime economy that had been operating for centuries, and that included Chinese, Macassan, Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French participants, all of whom had some knowledge of the continent that was about to become the newest British colony. The colony was not a beginning, it was an insertion into an existing system. And the families that came out of the insertion in the most powerful position were the ones who understood that system, who had access to it, who could use the knowledge and connections it contained to their advantage before their competitors understood that such knowledge and connections existed. Let's talk about something specific and strange that sits in the historical record and doesn't get the attention it deserves. It is a set of objects and a set of stories about those objects that collectively suggest a kind of contact with Australia that precedes 1788 by a margin that challenges the official narrative in ways that most historians prefer not to engage with. In 1969, a retired school teacher named Patsy Adams Smith published a book called Moonbird People about the mutton bird hunters of Bass Strait. In researching the book, she collected oral histories from the descendants of the sealers who had worked Bass Strait in the early 19th century. And in those oral histories, she found consistent references to objects found on the islands of Bass Strait that the sealers and their descendants described as old in a way that meant before the sealers were there. Coins in some accounts, small metal tools, pieces of worked stone that were not Aboriginal in style but were also not European. Objects that had been found buried or cached in locations on the smaller islands of the strait. The objects themselves are gone. They were not preserved. The sealers were practical men who did not value what they couldn't use, and the things they found that seemed old and foreign were usually discarded or lost. But the stories about them persisted, passed down through the families that had worked the strait. And when Adam Smith collected them, they had the character of genuine oral tradition, consistent in their core elements, varying in minor details in the way authentic memories vary, and accompanied by the kind of contextual detail that is usually absent from pure invention. What were those objects? Where did they come from? The honest answer is that we cannot know because the physical evidence is gone, but they fit into a broader pattern of anomalous objects that turn up in Australian contexts and that don't have clean explanations. The allegedly Portuguese cannon that was found at Darwin Harbour in the 19th century. The various reports of worked stone structures in the Western Australian interior that were documented by early settlers and then not followed up by formal archaeology. The coins of clearly Asian origin that were occasionally turned up in soil contexts that suggested they had been there for a long time. None of these constitutes definitive proof of anything, but collectively they form a suggestion that the Australian continent was not as isolated from the rest of the world as the official narrative requires it to have been. And here is why this matters for our story about the founding families. If Australia was less isolated than the narrative says, if there was contact, commercial and otherwise, in the centuries before 1788, then the people who knew about that contact had an informational advantage when the colony was established. They knew what the country could produce, they knew approximately what its geography looked like. They had a framework for understanding it that the ordinary settler, arriving cold with no prior information, did not have. And if that informational advantage was the foundation of the colonial fortunes, if the reason certain families moved so fast and accumulated so much is because they started with knowledge that others lacked, then the question of where that knowledge came from is the central question. Not a side question, not a curiosity. The central question. And the fact that mainstream Australian history has never seriously asked it tells you something. It tells you that the question, if answered honestly, would threaten things that powerful institutions have an interest in protecting. The narrative of colonial Australia as a fresh start, as a place that was empty before the British arrived, as a success story built by individual enterprise and colonial initiative, is a narrative that serves the interests of the descendants of the colonial elite. Not in a cynical, conscious way, necessarily. These things are rarely cynical and conscious at the level of individual motivation, but institutionally, the narrative serves particular interests, and narratives that serve particular interests tend to resist examination of their foundations. Let me give you another example. The pastoral expansion into Queensland. Queensland's history as a separate colony only begins in 1859. But the pastoral runs that became the foundation of Queensland's economy were being established well before that date, before Queensland was even formally constituted as a political entity. The squatters who moved into the Darling Downs, into the Maranoa, into the central Queensland tablelands, into the Channel Country, were doing so with information that the official exploration narrative cannot account for. Alan Cunningham, who explored the Darling Downs in 1827, is credited with the European discovery of one of the finest agricultural regions in Australia. And Cunningham was a real explorer who did genuinely important work. But the people who moved onto the Darling Downs behind Cunningham, who applied for pastoral leases and stocked the country within years of his report, had been watching for exactly this kind of favorable report on a region that they, in some cases, had reason to believe was worth watching. The pattern of rapid, precisely targeted expansion of people moving directly to the best country appears again in Queensland, just as it appeared in New South Wales. The Leslie brothers, Patrick and Walter and George, were among the first squatters on the Darling Downs. They arrived from Scotland with capital and with connections to the established pastoral elite of New South Wales, and they moved onto the Downs within a year of Cunningham's report. They didn't explore. They moved in with a clear picture of what they were looking for and where to find it. Their establishment at Canning Downs became one of the finest pastoral properties in the Darling Downs district, and the Leslie family became one of the foundational pastoral dynasties of Queensland. Their capital came from Scotland. Their connections were to the pastoral establishment of New South Wales. Their knowledge of where the best country was seems to have been more than guesswork, and their success was rapid in a way that by now should be starting to feel familiar. The Leslies, the MacArthurs, the Wentworths, the Duracks, different names, different decades, different parts of the continent, but the same pattern, capital arriving before the infrastructure to generate it. Knowledge of the land preceding the official discovery of that land. Networks of protection ensuring that no serious challenge to their position could be mounted by governors or competing settlers or colonial courts. And underscoring all of it, a set of connections to interests in London, in the city, in the banking and trading houses that financed the British Empire, that ensured the colonial fortunes were not just local success stories, but were integrated into a global flow of capital that made them much more stable than their provincial setting would suggest. There is a particular London institution that I want to spend some time on because it sits at the center of the web of colonial Australian wealth formation in a way that is very rarely acknowledged. That institution is the East India Company. The East India Company, by the late 18th century, was not just a trading company. It was effectively a private government with its own army, its own navy, its own courts, its own diplomatic service, and its own extensive intelligence gathering operation. It controlled enormous territories. It had financial interests that extended far beyond the Indian subcontinent, into Southeast Asia, into China, into the Pacific. It was, by many measures, the most powerful commercial organization in the world. And it had an interest in Australia, not an official, admitted, incorporated interest. The East India Company's Royal Charter gave it a monopoly on trade in certain areas, including parts of the Pacific, and the establishment of a British colony in Australia created complicated questions about how that monopoly would operate. The company had reasons to want to be involved in the colony, and reasons to want that involvement to be managed carefully and not too visibly. Several of the early commercial figures of the colony had East India Company connections. Not all of them, but enough that the connection is notable. Officers who had served in India, merchants who had trading relationships with company houses, men who had access to the company's intelligence networks about Pacific geography and its commercial possibilities. The company's records, which are held in the British Library and are among the most extensive archives of the British Empire period, contain references to Australia, to the colony, to individuals in the colony, that the mainstream history of colonial Australia rarely engages with. The East India Company was dissolved in 1874. After the Indian Mutiny of 1857 led to the British government taking direct control of India. But by 1874, the interests that the company had represented, the commercial and banking houses, the networks of trade and capital, had been absorbed into the broader structure of British imperial finance. The company dissolved. The system it had created did not, and the connections to colonial Australia that had developed under company influence continued to operate through those successor institutions. The Bank of Australasia, which was a significant force in colonial Australian banking in the middle decades of the 19th century, was closely connected to London commercial interests with East India Company roots. The Australian and New Zealand Banking Group, which is one of Australia's major banks today, traces its history to the Bank of Australasia and through it to those 19th century commercial networks. The thread runs from the company through the colonial banking system into the contemporary financial landscape. This is not unusual by the standards of how capitalism works. Capital accumulates, institutions are built, institutions persist. The money that was accumulated in colonial Australia through the mechanisms we have been discussing, the early land grants, the pastoral expansion, the banking monopolies, the wool trade, that money was invested in institutions that continued to generate returns for the families and for the British commercial interests connected to them. And those institutions became the framework of Australian economic life. What is unusual is the starting point. The fact that the money was accumulated so fast by such a small group, from such a specific set of opportunities, in ways that the official record only partially explains. The fact that the connections to London commercial interests, to institutions with deep roots in the East India Company, and the broader machinery of British commercial empire appear in the very earliest period of the colony, before those connections should have been established through ordinary commercial development. Let me put this a different way. Normally, in a new colonial settlement, the sequence goes like this. Settlers arrive, they work the land, over time, they accumulate surplus. That surplus gets invested in local commerce and in connections to metropolitan markets. Over a generation or two, a commercial class develops. That commercial class then builds banking institutions, establishes credit relationships with metropolitan finance, and integrates the colonial economy into the global commercial system. What happened in colonial Australia was different. The commercial relationships with metropolitan finance appear almost immediately. The banking institutions appear extremely quickly. The integration into global wool markets appears within years of the first productive pastoral runs, which themselves appear within years of the colony's establishment. The sequence is compressed to a degree that doesn't fit the normal model of colonial development. It is compressed as if someone already knew what the outcome would be and had pre-positioned the institutional infrastructure to capture it. Someone did know, or at least some people had strong reason to expect. And those people, or the interests they represented, had prepared accordingly. I want to come back now to a question I raised earlier in a slightly different form. Who was protecting these families? Because protection is one of the clearest signs that an interest is operating at a level above individual ambition. When a man makes a mistake, gets into legal trouble, clashes with a powerful official, and instead of being destroyed by the conflict, he emerges stronger, that tells you something. It tells you that someone with more power than the official he clashed with was intervening on his behalf. John MacArthur clashed with 3 successive governors and survived each confrontation. Not just survived, but prospered. Each confrontation at the time looked like it might destroy him. Each time the outcome was favorable to him. This is not luck. This is not just cleverness, though MacArthur was genuinely clever. This is protection. Someone was ensuring that the man the colony needed him to be could not be removed by any governor who was merely carrying out official policy. Who could do that? Who had enough influence over the colonial office in London, over the appointment and instruction of governors, over the legal processes that adjudicated disputes between powerful colonists and colonial administrators to ensure that outcome repeatedly? An individual merchant, however wealthy, could not. A single banking house could not. What could was the kind of connected institutional interests that I've been describing. An interest that had access to multiple levers of influence that could operate through political connections, through commercial relationships, through the kind of informal but reliable network that the club culture and the Masonic culture and the East India Company culture all created in this period. That interest existed, it was real, and its effects are written in the outcomes of colonial Australian history, in the land that accumulated in certain hands, in the fortunes that materialized from the early colonial economy, in the dynasties that formed and persisted. The fact that the interest itself is not named in the record is not evidence that it didn't exist. It is evidence that it was sophisticated enough to operate without leaving its name on things. Let's talk about women, because the women in these stories are almost always invisible in the official history, and their invisibility is itself interesting. Colonial Australian history is overwhelmingly a history of men. The governors, the squatters, the merchants, the explorers. The women appear in supporting roles as wives and mothers, occasionally as interesting individuals who defied their expected role, but rarely as economic actors in their own right. This reflects both the actual legal and social constraints on women in the colonial period and the interpretive choices of historians who came after. but there are women in the founding stories of colonial wealth whose roles, when you look carefully, are more significant than the narrative acknowledges. And some of what is most interesting about them concerns not their husband's activities, but their own family origins. Elizabeth MacArthur, John MacArthur's wife, managed Camden Park for the 8 years that John spent in England after 1809. She ran the wool operation. She maintained the sheep breeding program. She managed the labor force. She corresponded with the wool buyers in London. She kept the financial accounts. By any reasonable measure, she was the operational head of what was at that point one of the most significant pastoral enterprises in Australia, and she did it well. The operation did not decline while John was away, it grew. Elizabeth MacArthur was, by all accounts, an extremely capable woman. She was also a woman with an interesting background. She came from Devon, from a family of modest means, and she had been educated in a way that was unusual for a woman of her social position. She had Latin. She had mathematics. She had a level of engagement with practical and commercial subjects that went beyond what girls of her background typically received. How she got this education and whether it reflected a particular orientation in her family toward practical rather than ornamental female accomplishment is something the histories don't much explore. What it suggests is that Elizabeth was not simply a capable administrator who rose to the occasion when her husband was absent. She was someone who had the skills for what she was doing before she needed them. Someone who had been perhaps deliberately prepared for a role that required exactly the combination of abilities she demonstrated. The management of a complex pastoral enterprise in a distant colony, with all the correspondence, accounting, animal husbandry knowledge, and labor management that entailed. There is also the figure of Mary Reeby, which is one of the more extraordinary stories in colonial Australian economic history, and one that does get told, but usually in a simplified form that loses the most interesting parts. Mary Reeby arrived in the colony in 1792 as a convict, transported for horse stealing at the age of 13. She was from Lancashire. Her family background is obscure in the usual ways. She had been living at the time of her arrest with her grandmother in circumstances that suggest her parents were absent or dead, and that she was not from a comfortable social position. She served her sentence, married a merchant named Thomas Reeby, and then, after Thomas died in 1811, she ran his business interests herself, and she was extraordinary at it. Within a decade of Thomas's death, she had expanded the business to include ships, wharves, farms, real estate, and a general trading operation that made her one of the wealthiest people in the colony. Her face is now on the $20 note. She is, in the official historical narrative, a triumphant story of individual enterprise overcoming the stigma of convict origins. But there are aspects of Mary Reiby's story that don't quite fit. The speed with which she understood the colonial commercial environment, the sophistication of her business decisions, the network of connections she demonstrated from relatively early in her independent business career, these suggest someone with more background than a 13-year-old horse thief from Lancashire should have had. The question of who prepared her or who she was before the horse stealing incident that brought her to Australia is one that researchers have struggled with. Her family background, when you trace it, is murky in specific ways. The grandmother she was living with appears in records but without clear antecedents. The circumstances of her upbringing are unclear. There are theories, none of them provable, that she was not quite who the official record says she was, that her convict arrival was, in some sense, arranged or at least not entirely coincidental with her subsequent commercial career in the colony. I am not saying Mary Ryby was a plant sent deliberately to the colony to serve some commercial interest. That is too dramatic and too tidy. But I am saying that the official story of her rise from convicted horse thief to colonial commercial giant has gaps in it that are consistent with the broader pattern I have been describing. The gap between who she is supposed to have been and what she was able to do is too large to be entirely explained by natural talent and lucky marriage. The women of the founding colonial families carried knowledge and connections that are even more obscured than those of their husbands, because women were not supposed to have such things in the social framework of the colonial period, but they did. And the management capacity, the commercial intelligence, the network awareness that Elizabeth MacArthur and Mary Ryby and a handful of others demonstrated was not conjured from nothing. It came from somewhere. And that somewhere is not documented in the way it needs to be for us to fully understand what we are looking at. Let me now pull back and look at the whole picture from a greater distance, because I think that is necessary before we can draw any conclusions about what it means. The big picture looks like this. In 1788, a British colony was established at Botany Bay. It was officially a penal colony, a place to put the surplus criminal population of a Britain undergoing rapid social transformation due to industrialization and urbanization. This is the official reason for the colony, and it was real in the sense that convicts were genuinely sent and genuinely served their sentences. But it was probably not the whole reason. Colonies established primarily to house criminals do not typically receive the quality and quantity of agricultural and commercial infrastructure that New South Wales received in its first 2 decades. Penal colonies do not usually develop into major wool-producing economies within 25 years of establishment. Prisons do not typically attract the network of London commercial interests that attach to New South Wales almost immediately. Australia was always going to be more than a prison. The question was whether the people who understood that knew it before 1788, and the evidence suggests they did. A small number of commercially and maritimely sophisticated men with connections to the networks of geographic and commercial intelligence that circulated in London and in the East India Company and in the maritime trade routes of the Pacific, understood what Australia was and what it could become before the First Fleet sailed, and they positioned their interests to benefit from its development. Some of them came to Australia personally on the early transport ships, in the officer and administrator class. Some of them operated from London, backing the men who were on the ground. And the men they backed in the colony took advantage of every structural opportunity the colonial system provided to accumulate land, livestock, credit, and political influence with a speed and specificity that makes no sense as the product of individual enterprise alone. This is not a secret society story in the traditional sense. It is not a story about a cabal of men sitting in a smoky room and planning the conquest of a continent with precise coordination. Human affairs are rarely that tidy. What it is, rather, is a story about information asymmetry, about a small number of people having access to knowledge that others didn't have, and using that knowledge advantage to position themselves at the beginning of a process that they understood was going to produce enormous wealth. The knowledge they had was geographic, commercial, and political. Geographic because they knew or had reason to suspect what Australia's productive potential was. Commercial because they understood the global markets, particularly the English wool market, that Australian pastoral production would be able to serve. Political because they had connections to the people in the colonial office and in Parliament who would make the decisions about how the colony was governed and how land would be distributed. They used this knowledge to move faster than their competitors. They established themselves before the colony's productive potential was publicly understood. They accumulated land and livestock and financial positions that, by the time other settlers and investors began to understand what was available, were already large enough to be effectively unassailable. They used the colonial administration, sometimes in conflict with it and sometimes in cooperation with it, to defend and extend those positions. And they built dynastic families that carried the accumulated wealth and the institutional connections of the founding generation forward into the 19th and 20th centuries. That is the big picture. And the big picture, stated plainly, is simply this. The founding wealth of colonial Australia was not a product of hard work and good fortune equally available to all comers. It was a product of pre-positioned advantage, of people who arrived knowing more than they were supposed to know, connected to interests that were more powerful than their individual positions would suggest, operating in a system that was structured from the beginning, whether deliberately or emergently, to reward exactly the kind of advantage they had. This does not mean that individual effort and intelligence played no role. John MacArthur was genuinely intelligent. Elizabeth MacArthur was genuinely capable. The squatters who drove cattle across the dividing range were genuinely courageous. The merchants who built trading empires in Sydney and Melbourne were genuinely enterprising. None of this is fake. But enterprise and intelligence in colonial Australia, as in every other context, operated within a structure. And the structure was not neutral. It was built to favor certain people. And those certain people had been identified by some combination of deliberate planning and informal network logic before the colony ever existed. The families that came out of the colonial period as the Great Australian Dynasties, the families whose wealth persists in various forms to the present day, the families whose names are on buildings in suburbs and universities across the country, those families did not emerge from a fair competition. They emerged from a structured advantage. And the structure was created by interests that operated in the early years of the colony, with a clarity of purpose that the official history has never fully examined. Now I want to talk about what happened to all that wealth, because the colonial foundations are not just history, they are the beginning of an ongoing accumulation that reaches into the present. The pastoral fortunes of the colonial period did not simply persist unchanged into the modern era. They went through a series of transformations that transferred wealth from one form to another, while maintaining, with remarkable continuity, the connection between those original colonial positions and contemporary economic power. The first transformation was the decline of the wool economy in the late 19th century. This is a complicated story, but the short version is that the great pastoral runs, which had been extraordinarily profitable during the boom years of the mid-19th century, became less profitable as wool prices fell, as drought struck, as the speculative investment that had backed the pastoral expansion in the 1870s and 1880s collapsed in the banking crisis of the early 1890s. Many squatters went broke. Land that had seemed worth enormous amounts on paper turned out to be worth much less in a market that no longer wanted to pay the prices that had been assumed. But here is the thing about wealth that has been in the family for multiple generations. It has options that first generation wealth does not have. A family that was accumulating in the first 50 years of the colony, that built its position through the mechanisms we have been discussing, that was in a strong enough financial position to survive the inevitable downturns that came as the colony matured, was a family with choices. They could diversify. They could sell pastoral land at its 1880s peak price before the crash and invest the proceeds in urban real estate, in manufacturing, in finance. They could use their connections to navigate the new economy of the Federation period, finding positions in the structures of the newly formed Australian state that replicated at a different scale the advantages they had held in the colonial period. Some of the great pastoral families did exactly this. The MacArthur family transitioned from wool production into rural and urban real estate, into shareholdings in the new commercial institutions of Federated Australia, into positions of social and political influence that maintained their relevance and their wealth without requiring them to keep succeeding as pastoralists. The capital that had been assembled in the colonial period was a kind of stored potential, convertible into whatever form was most useful in the current economic environment. The families that survived the transition from colonial to federal Australia and beyond into the 20th century did so by understanding something fundamental about how accumulated wealth works. It is not tied to any particular industry or any particular form. It is a quantity of social and economic power that can be deployed in whatever direction offers the best return in the current environment. The pastoral families that became urban real estate dynasties, that became financial families, that became manufacturing interests, that became media proprietors in the 20th century, were doing something completely continuous with what their founders had done in the colonial period. They were taking an information and network advantage and translating it into the best available return. Consider the Fairfax family. John Fairfax arrived in Australia in 1838 and purchased the Sydney Morning Herald in 1841. He was English from Warwickshire, and his stated background was as a printer and bookseller. But his ability to purchase one of the colony's most significant newspapers within 3 years of arrival, his connections in the colonial commercial community that allowed him to run it successfully, his political instincts, these suggest someone who arrived with more than a printer's background, with connections and capital that went beyond what a Warwickshire bookseller should have had. The Fairfax family controlled the Sydney Morning Herald and associated publications for over a century. They were at the centre of Australian public life throughout the colonial and federal periods. Their media interests gave them influence over public opinion that was, by any measure, enormous. And they used that influence in ways that were generally favourable to the interests of the established commercial class, because they were part of the established commercial class, because their own interests were aligned with the interests of the network that had built colonial Australia. The Murdoch family is a later version of the same dynamic. Keith Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's father, built his newspaper interests in Australia starting in the 1920s. Rupert Murdoch took the family's Australian base and turned it into a global media empire. The Murdoch story is often told as a story of individual genius and strategic vision. And those things are real. Rupert Murdoch is genuinely extraordinary in his business capabilities. But the foundation that he built on, the Australian newspaper base that gave him his starting capital and his starting influence, was itself built on colonial era wealth and connections that had been accumulating since Keith Murdoch's own entry into Australian media life. These cases, the Fairfaxes and the Murdochs and others, illustrate the principle that colonial foundations matter in the long term. The fortunes and the networks that were established in the first 50 years of the colony did not simply vanish when the colonial era ended. They were transformed, diversified, redeployed. They became the foundations of the media landscape, the financial sector, the property sector of modern Australia. And in some cases, they extended far beyond Australia into global commercial empires that could trace their ultimate origin to a pastoral run in New South Wales or Victoria established in the 1820s or 1830s. The continuity is real. It is not always obvious because families change their names when daughters marry and the direct patrilineal line is broken, because money moves through companies and trusts that don't bear family names, because the connection between contemporary wealth and colonial origins is deliberately obscured by a culture that prefers the myth of the self-made man. But when you trace the threads carefully, when you follow the money and the land and the institutional connections back through the generations, you find that the colonial foundations are not as distant as they appear. Australia is a young country in one sense. It has only had European settlement for a little over 200 years, but the patterns of wealth and power that were established in the first 50 of those years have shown remarkable persistence. The families that were at the top in 1850 are disproportionately still at the top or connected to institutions that are at the top in ways that cannot be fully explained by subsequent merit and enterprise alone. Now, I want to take you somewhere that the standard history of colonial Australian wealth rarely goes. I want to talk about what was destroyed in the process of building these fortunes, not in a political sense, in a factual, material sense, because the destruction is part of the story. And understanding what was destroyed helps us understand why the foundation of the fortunes is so carefully obscured. The Aboriginal Australian population at the time of the First Fleet is estimated to have been somewhere between 300,000 and 1,000 people, though estimates vary widely and the truth is unknowable with precision. By 1900, that population had been reduced to somewhere around 100,000. The decline was caused by disease, by violence, by the destruction of the food systems that sustained Aboriginal communities, by the forced removal of Aboriginal people from their traditional country, and by the general devastation that follows the rapid displacement of one society by another. The pastoral expansion was the primary engine of this devastation in the interior of the continent. As squatters moved their sheep and cattle onto Aboriginal country, they disrupted the burning regimes that maintained the grasslands, fenced or diverted water sources, killed or displaced the native animals that were the primary food sources for Aboriginal communities, and treated any Aboriginal resistance to this process as a threat to be eliminated. The massacres of the frontier era are documented in the historical record, though not always prominently. They were systematic, they were coordinated, and they were sometimes carried out with the tacit or explicit approval of colonial administrations that understood the pastoral expansion required the removal of Aboriginal people from the country being taken. This is the foundation on which the colonial fortunes were built, not metaphorically, not abstractly, but literally. The land that became Camden Park, the land that became Vaucluse, the land that became the Great Darling Down stations, the land that became the Kimberley and the Channel Country and the Monaro Runs, Every acre of it had people on it. Every acre of it was being actively managed and lived upon. And the process of making it available for pastoral use involved the displacement and often the destruction of those people. The families that built their fortunes on that land knew this was happening. Their journals and letters document it in terms that range from regret to cold-blooded calculation. The legal system provided them cover. Aboriginal Australians did not have legal standing that the colonial courts were required to recognize. The colonial administration provided them support. Governors who allowed pastoral expansion were implicitly allowing the violence that accompanied it, and the interests in London provided them distance. The people who were ultimately profiting from the wool trade did not have to watch the process by which the wool country was cleared. Understanding this does not change the factual history of how the fortunes were assembled. It contextualizes it. The speed with which the pastoral expansion proceeded, the apparently miraculous knowledge of where the good country was, the ability to position precisely in the most productive areas. All of these advantages were not achieved in a vacuum. They were achieved by displacing people who had lived in those places for thousands of years, and whose presence was the reason the country was as productive as it was. The dispossession was not incidental to the fortune building, it was the mechanism. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why the question of where the colonial fortunes came from is so uncomfortable. Why the official history is so careful not to look too closely at the early accumulation phase. Why the narrative of individual enterprise and colonial initiative serves such powerful interests. Because looking carefully at the foundation reveals not just mysterious origins of capital and connections, but the mechanism by which those connections and that capital were deployed. And that mechanism was the systematic destruction of the first Australians. Now, let me tell you about something that is happening right now, in the present, that connects back directly to everything we have been discussing. There is an ongoing argument in Australia, a political and legal and moral argument, about what is called native title, about the legal recognition of Aboriginal Australians' rights to country that was never formally ceded to the Crown, never sold, never surrendered through any treaty or formal agreement. The Mabo decision of 1992, the Native Title Act of 1993, and the subsequent decades of litigation and negotiation over native title claims have been one of the most significant and contentious areas of Australian law and politics. The resistance to native title, which has been fierce and sustained, has come primarily from the pastoral industry and from the mining industry, from the industries that built their foundations on land that was taken. The argument against native title is framed in various ways: economic efficiency, legal certainty, the rights of current landholders versus historical claims. But underneath all of those framings is a simpler reality. Native title threatens, in a specific and practical sense, the property rights that are the foundation of the great Australian rural fortunes. It threatens to complicate the title, literally the legal ownership document, of land that in many cases goes back to the original pastoral leases of the squatting era. The families whose wealth traces back to those original squatting leases have not been passive observers of this argument. They have funded political campaigns. They have supported lobby groups. They have donated to political parties that favor their position. They have used their media interests, where they have them, to frame the public discourse about native title in terms favorable to their own interests. The machinery of Australian political influence has been deployed, as it has been deployed for 200 years, to protect the foundations of the fortunes that were assembled in the first decades of the colony. This is the through line. From the officer merchant network of the 1790s to the contemporary argument over native title, from the land grants of the Macquarie period to the pastoral leases that are still in the same families or in the successor corporations. The system that was put in place in the early colonial period to translate Australian land into wealth for a small number of connected interests has proven extraordinarily durable. It has survived the gold rush, the 1890s bust, Federation, 2 world wars, the post-war boom, the decline of the wool economy, the mining boom. It adapts, it transforms, it moves capital from one form to another, but it persists. There is a map that I want you to imagine. Not a real map, though real maps like it exist in various archives. An imaginary one that overlays several different data sets onto the Australian continent. The first layer of the map shows the distribution of Aboriginal language groups and their approximate territorial boundaries as they existed before 1788. This is a map of a managed continent, of a landscape that had been organized by human culture and intelligence over tens of thousands of years into a mosaic of distinct but interconnected communities. The second layer shows the earliest pastoral runs established by the squatting families in the 1820s and 1830s. Concentrations in the Darling Downs, in the Western Plains of New South Wales, in the Port Phillip district, in the country between the Lachlan and the Murrumbidgee rivers. These runs, when you overlay them on the first layer, are concentrated in exactly the areas where Aboriginal land management had produced the most productive grasslands. Not coincidentally, by design, whether or not that design was explicitly conscious. The third layer shows the location of the massacres and displacement events of the pastoral frontier. These cluster, predictably, around the boundaries of the pastoral runs, in the areas where Aboriginal communities were actively resisting the pastoral expansion, or simply existing in places where the pastoralists needed to move their sheep. The frontier violence is not random. It follows the pastoral expansion with the precision of a shadow. The fourth layer shows the land that is still in the hands of families that can trace their tenure to the colonial pastoral period. Reduced in area from the peak of the squatting era, broken up by various land reforms and closer settlement policies, but still present, still held. In some cases in the same families for 6 or 7 generations. In others, in successor companies or trusts that obscure but maintain the connection to the original accumulation. And the fifth layer, the last one, shows the distribution of contemporary Australian wealth at the level of family dynasties. The overlap between this layer and the fourth is striking, though not complete. Other fortunes have been made through mining, through finance, through technology and retail that don't have pastoral colonial foundations. But the pastoral colonial foundations are there, visible in the fifth layer, in a way that makes the connection between the original accumulation and contemporary wealth unmistakable. This is what structural advantage looks like when you render it spatially. It looks like country that was taken from people who managed it well, redistributed to people who were positioned to receive it, and then held through 2 centuries of political and legal and commercial maneuvering that prevented it from being redistributed again. It looks like a foundational accumulation that was never seriously challenged, that compounded and diversified and persisted. The map I am asking you to imagine is not a conspiracy theory. It is a pattern. Patterns have explanations, and the explanation of this particular pattern, the explanation of why Australian wealth is distributed the way it is, runs through the questions we have been asking all night. Where did the knowledge come from? Where did the capital come from? Who was protecting these families? What connections made their advantage possible? And why has the official history been so reluctant to ask these questions in the same breath? I have been building towards something, and I want to say it now as plainly as I can. The story of Australia's wealthiest families appearing from nowhere in the 1800s is not, in the end, a story about nowhere. It is a story about somewhere very specific, and about people who knew where that somewhere was before they told anyone else. It is a story about information as the ultimate commercial advantage, about networks of connection that operated across distances and through institutions in ways that the people on the outside of those networks could not see and could not counter. It is a story about how a continent was organized for extraction before the apparatus of extraction arrived, and about how the people who organized it positioned themselves to capture the most valuable share of what was extracted. The families are real, the wealth is real, the land is real. What is not real, or at least not fully real, is the explanation that is usually given for where they came from. The explanation of individual enterprise and colonial opportunity and hard work and good luck, those things existed, but they are not sufficient to explain what we see. They are not sufficient to explain the speed. They are not sufficient to explain the specificity. They are not sufficient to explain the protection. They are not sufficient to explain the connections. Something else was there. Something that operated before the colony was formally established, that positioned certain interests to benefit from it, that maintained those positions through the challenges and disruptions of the first century of colonial history, and that transformed itself, generation by generation, into the contemporary economic power of the families and institutions that trace their roots to the colonial period. That something is not fully named in the historical record. It may never be fully named. The archives have gaps in exactly the right places. The questions that would reveal it most clearly are the questions that mainstream history has chosen not to ask. But it was there, and it is still there, transformed in the distribution of Australian wealth and power in the 21st century. Let me tell you about a place called Jugyong. It is a small town on the Murrumbidgee River in southern New South Wales, unremarkable to most people who drive past it on the road between Sydney and Canberra. But in the early squatting era, the country around Jugyong was some of the most contested pastoral territory in the colony. The river flats were extraordinarily productive. The surrounding hills, in a good season, could carry enormous numbers of sheep. The water was reliable in ways that other parts of the inland were not. And the Aboriginal people of that country, the Wiradjuri, were not inclined to accept the pastoral occupation without resistance. What happened around Jugyong in the 1820s and 1830s is a compressed version of what happened across the Australian inland. Squatters moved in. Wiradjuri resistance followed. Violence on both sides, but overwhelmingly in the direction of the Wiradjuri, followed the violence. Governor Darling declared martial law in the district in 1824. Mounted police units were deployed, not to protect settlers from violence, but to suppress Wiradjuri resistance to the pastoral occupation. The specific events that occurred in the hills around the Murrumbidgee in those years are documented in fragments in official reports that record the number of stock taken and the number of resistance incidents, and in the gaps between those official records where the full measure of what happened to the Wiradjuri community is not written down because it was not thought necessary to record. The families that took up pastoral runs in that country came out of the process as substantial landholders. The Hume family was there, Hamilton Hume being one of the great exploring figures of colonial New South Wales. The Badgerys were there, the Throsbys. Names that do not appear in the popular telling of Australian history the way MacArthur and Wentworth do, but names that accumulated land and social position in the middle ranks of the colonial pastoral class, and whose descendants carried that position forward through the Federation period and into the 20th century. The country around Jujeong is farming land now, some of it, and cattle and sheep country in the hills. It is unremarkable to drive through. There is nothing to see that tells you what happened there. No monument, no record at the roadside. Just hills and river and the occasional glimpse of old stone fencing that squatters built in the 1840s and 1850s. Fencing that is still standing, fencing that encloses land whose ownership traces through company names and land title records back to the families that were there in the beginning. Every part of Australia has its Jujeong. Every part has its story of pastoral expansion, of Wiradjuri or Gundungura or Darug or Kamilaroi or Eora or Jabwurrung or Jajawurrung or Gunaikurani or 100 other peoples whose country became the pastoral runs of the colonial period. And in every one of those places, the connection between the specific families who took the land and the contemporary holders of wealth that traces back to that land is, with patience and with access to the right archives, traceable. This is not comfortable history. It is not the kind of history that gets told at school. Partly because it is complicated and partly because it leads to questions that don't have easy answers. Questions about what the appropriate relationship should be between the foundations of Australian wealth and the people from whom the foundational assets were taken. Questions that the native title debate approaches but never fully resolves, because the legal framework of native title was designed carefully to stop well short of the kinds of reparative justice that fully honest accounting of the history would imply. I am not going to resolve those questions tonight. I am not equipped to resolve them, and neither is a YouTube video, but I want to name them clearly. I want to say plainly that the mystery of where the founding colonial fortunes came from is not fully a mystery of unknown connections and hidden networks and prepositioned capital, though it is partly those things. It is also a mystery of what happened on the ground in country that is still held and still valued between the Aboriginal Australians who were there and the squatters and pastoralists who took their place. And I want to say that these two parts of the mystery, the question of who knew what before the colony was established, and the question of what was done to the people who were already there, are not separate questions. They are the same question. The informational advantage that certain families had, the ability to know what the land was worth and to move to the best of it, before their competitors understood what they were doing, that advantage was derived ultimately from knowledge of a land that was inhabited, managed, and deeply understood by people who had been there for thousands of years. Those people were the source of the knowledge that made the colonial fortunes possible, and they were destroyed in the process. That is the deepest layer of the answer to the question that has been running through this whole story. Where did the colonial fortunes come from? At the most fundamental level, they came from the oldest civilization on Earth, from the knowledge and the land of the Aboriginal Australians, whose inheritance was taken and whose role in making the taking possible was then buried so thoroughly under the narrative of colonial enterprise and exploration and hard work, that you could read the entire official history of the colonial period and never once be confronted with the fact that the smartest thing the early colonists did was learn from the people they were displacing. Let's return in the final part of this story to some of the specific mysteries that we opened at the beginning. Not to resolve them, because in most cases they cannot be resolved with currently available evidence, but to say clearly what they are, what the possibilities are, and why they matter. The mystery of early pre-colonial contact. The evidence, fragmentary but persistent, that the Australian continent was known to and visited by various maritime cultures, Portuguese, Dutch, Macassan, Chinese, possibly others, in the centuries before 1788. The Dieppe maps, the mahogany ship, the Batavia survivors, the Macassan trepang fishes, the various anomalous artifacts that appear in Australian archaeological and historical records without clean explanations. What does this mean for the founding families? It means that the knowledge of Australia that circulated in certain maritime and commercial circles before 1788 was real, was specific, and was available to the people who had access to those circles. Whether that knowledge was organized into something that could be deliberately used to position interests for the colonial period, or whether it was more diffuse, more informal, less organized than that, is the question. I believe it was more organized than mainstream history acknowledges, and less organized than a deliberate conspiracy would require. I believe it was the kind of knowledge that circulates in commercial networks, that gets traded along with information about other productive locations, that accumulates in the heads of merchants and navigators and their associates over generations, and that can be drawn upon by people who know what questions to ask. The mystery of the early capital. Where did the money come from that allowed certain families to accumulate land and livestock at the rates they did in the first 50 years of the colony? I have suggested that it came from the networks of commercial interest, the East India Company connections, the London trading houses, the Masonic or Masonic adjacent networks of mutual commercial support that were already operating in the Pacific world before the colony was established. I cannot prove this in specific detail because the documentary evidence is incomplete in exactly the right places. But the scale of the early accumulation and the sophistication of the commercial operations that those families ran argue against any explanation that relies solely on colonial era income streams. The mystery of the protection, who was ensuring that the key figures in the early colonial wealth accumulation, MacArthur and Wentworth and their associates, came out of every confrontation with colonial authority in a stronger position than they went in. This mystery points most clearly to interests operating at the level of the British state or just below it, at the level of the colonial office, of parliament, of the commercial houses that had political connections at that level, at the level of the networks that could influence the appointment of governors, the framing of colonial land policy, the outcome of legal proceedings. Again, not a named conspiracy, a system in which people with power used it to protect interests that served them in a period when colonial development was an enormous commercial opportunity, and the people who were best positioned to profit from it were the people who already had power, the mystery of the knowledge. How did the squatters know where the best country was before the official surveys had been done? This is the most specific and in some ways the most interesting mystery, because it is the most directly testable in principle. If we had complete records of movement in the interior of New South Wales and Victoria in the 1820s and 1830s, before the squatting rush, we could determine whether there was unauthorized exploration happening ahead of the official expeditions. We don't have those records, but we have the circumstantial evidence of the squatting expansion itself, which is consistent with prior knowledge in ways that chance and good judgment don't fully explain. The answer to this specific mystery is probably multi-layered. Some of the knowledge came from Aboriginal people, directly or through chains of transmission via whalers and sealers and informal traders. Some of it may have come from unauthorized individual movement in the interior that never made it into the written record. Some of it may have come from the accumulated geographic intelligence of the maritime networks we have been discussing. And some of it, I believe, was genuine on-the-ground expertise, the ability of experienced bushmen to read a landscape and make better predictions than their competitors about where the productive country would be. These mysteries taken together don't add up to a simple solution. They add up to something more interesting. They add up to a picture of a colonial economy that was more pre-organized, more connected to global commercial interests, more dependent on prior knowledge and prior positioning, and more built on the foundation of Aboriginal dispossession than the official history acknowledges. A picture in which the emergence of the great colonial fortunes was not a surprise, not a product of random individual success stories, but a predictable outcome of structural conditions that were partially deliberate and partially the product of how imperial commercial systems work when they encounter new territories. There is one more mystery I want to name before we begin to close this story. It is the mystery of the silence. Why has mainstream Australian history been so incurious about these questions? Why has the academic history of colonial Australia, which is a serious and sophisticated field, not produced a major account that takes seriously the questions of prepositioning, of prior commercial knowledge, of the role of connected metropolitan interests in shaping the colonial accumulation? Why are these questions left to people like me, making long YouTube videos in the middle of the night, rather than being the subject of careful archival research and peer-reviewed publication? I think the answer is complicated. Part of it is disciplinary. Academic historians are trained to work with the documentary record. And when the documentary record has specific gaps, the training is to acknowledge the gaps and move on rather than to speculate about what might explain them. Part of it is institutional. The universities and research institutions that fund historical research are themselves embedded in the contemporary Australian establishment, which has an interest in a certain version of the colonial history. And part of it is cultural. Australia has a powerful myth of the fair go, of a society that was built on equal opportunity and individual effort, and that myth serves important social and political functions that the full, honest accounting of the colonial wealth story would threaten. But silence is itself a form of evidence. A silence that appears in exactly the right places around exactly the questions whose answers would be most uncomfortable is not the same as a silence produced by simple ignorance. It is a silence that has been maintained, and maintained silences in historical research as in criminal investigation are usually maintained for reasons. Here is something I've been thinking about for the entire length of this story. Something that I want to share because it feels important in a way that goes beyond the historical detail. Human beings are very good at forgetting the foundations of things. We see what is in front of us, the cities and the institutions and the legal systems and the economic relationships of the present. and we treat them as if they were always there, or as if they arrived through a process that was fair and rational and comprehensible. We do not by instinct ask what was there before. We do not ask what was broken in order to build what stands now. Not because we are dishonest, but because the present is large and loud and the past is quiet. The pastoral runs of colonial Australia are quiet, the wool empires are gone or transformed beyond recognition. The squatters' huts have fallen down or been replaced by more permanent buildings. The specific encounters, the specific moments of dispossession and violence and knowledge transfer that built the foundations, are lost in the general silence of historical time. What remains are property titles and family names and the occasional stone wall in a paddock, and the general fact that some families have always had more than others, which seems like a natural condition rather than the product of specific historical choices. But it is not a natural condition. It is not a random distribution. It is the result of specific choices made by specific people in a specific period with specific consequences. And those choices and their consequences are still with us. They are with us in the ownership patterns of Australian land. They are with us in the institutional structures of Australian finance and media and politics. They are with us in the ongoing argument about native title and about how Australia should understand its colonial history. They are with us in the Aboriginal communities that are still struggling with the consequences of dispossession that began in the 1820s and 1830s, and that was never fully reversed. The families that emerged from the colonial period as the great Australian dynasties are still there. Transformed, diversified, sometimes connected to the colonial origins only through complex chains of inheritance and investment, but there. And the country that built those families, the country that was taken and managed and turned from a landscape inhabited by the oldest civilization on earth into a source of pastoral wealth for a small number of connected British interests, that country is still there too, still producing, still valuable, still in many cases in the same hands, in the sense that the institutional holders of the land can trace their title back through the squatters to the original colonial grants. This is not an argument for any specific political position. I am not going to tell you what you should think Australia ought to do about its colonial heritage. That is a conversation that Australians need to have with each other, and that conversation is already happening in the courts and in the parliament and in the communities that are most directly affected. What I'm telling you is that the conversation cannot be had honestly without acknowledging what actually happened, without asking the questions that the official history does not ask, without following the money and the land and the connections back to where they actually came from. The question we started with, who are Australia's wealthiest families and where did they come from, turns out not to have a simple answer. It turns out to have an answer that runs through centuries of maritime history, through the commercial networks of the British Empire and its predecessors, through the pre-colonial knowledge of a continent that was inhabited and managed for 40,000 years, through the systematic violence of the pastoral frontier, through the compounding dynamics of capital accumulation, through the institutional inertia of banking and legal systems that preserve the distributions of the colonial period, through everything. It is not a small story. It is as big a story as Australia itself, because it is the story of how Australia became what it is. The families appeared from nowhere. That is the phrase, that is the mystery. but they didn't appear from nowhere. They appeared from somewhere, from a set of connections and preparations and pre-existing knowledge that the official history cannot account for and has not tried to. They appeared from the same networks of maritime and commercial intelligence that had been mapping and understanding the productive potential of the Australian continent long before the British government decided that Botany Bay would make a good place for a prison. They appeared from the interests of people who understood or who were advised by people who understood that a new British colony in the Southern Hemisphere was going to be an enormous commercial opportunity if you were positioned correctly from the beginning. And so they were positioned, and so they took the land, and so the families were established, and so the wealth accumulated, and so Australia became what it is today. A wealthy country with a particular distribution of that wealth that traces, in ways both visible and obscured, back to those early years when certain men arrived knowing more than they should have known, and took more than the official system was supposed to allow. That is the story. It is not finished. It is still being written in the legal proceedings over native title, in the political debates about recognition and treaty, in the scholarship that is slowly, carefully building a more complete picture of what actually happened in those first 50 years. It is being written in the decisions that contemporary Australians are making about how to understand their country's past and what obligations that understanding creates. And it is a story that does not have a villain in the simple sense. It has interests, it has systems, it has the logic of imperial commercial expansion, which does not require individual villainy to produce the outcomes it produces. It has human beings making choices within structures that constrained some choices and rewarded others. Structures that were not neutral and were not accidental, but that were never the product of a single mind or a single plan. But it does have victims. It has the Aboriginal Australians whose land and whose knowledge and whose people were consumed in the building of the colonial economy. And their presence in the story, their centrality to the answer of where the colonial fortunes came from, is the thing that the official history is most reluctant to acknowledge. Because acknowledging it requires acknowledging not just that things went wrong, but that the foundations of what went right, the wealth and the institutional development and the economic success of the colonial period were built on something that was taken, something that was not freely given, something whose loss was not incidental to the achievement but essential to it. That is where the money came from. That is where the families came from. That is where Australia came from. And now, because it is very late and because you have been listening for a long time, and because this is the kind of story that works best when you let it settle in the quiet after it is over, let me tell you where I think all of this leaves us. It leaves us with a continent that is simultaneously very young and very old. Very young in terms of its European history, just over 200 years, a blink in the span of human civilization. Very old in terms of the human history that preceded that European period, 50,000 years. The longest continuous cultural tradition that archaeology has been able to identify anywhere on Earth. It leaves us with a set of wealth distributions that are the product of specific historical choices, not of neutral processes or of natural talent expressing itself in a fair environment. And it leaves us with the knowledge that those distributions, while powerful and persistent, are not inevitable. They are historical. And what is historical can be examined, can be understood, and can, in principle, be changed. It leaves us with questions. Big ones. The question of what genuine historical honesty about the colonial period requires. The question of what relationship should exist between the contemporary holders of wealth that traces to colonial accumulation and the communities that were dispossessed in the process of that accumulation. The question of how a country builds a shared future when the foundation of its present was built on a process that was not shared equally and was not asked for by most of the people it involved. Those questions are not mine to answer, they are Australia's to answer. But they can only be answered honestly if the story is told honestly, if the questions that the official history avoids are asked. If the mystery of where the founding families came from is pursued with the same seriousness that would be applied to any other historical mystery of comparable significance. I began tonight by saying that there was an official version of Australian colonial history and another version that sits in the gaps. I have tried to give you a sense of the other version, or at least of some of its most important elements. I have tried to trace the connections, to follow the money and the land and the knowledge and the networks back toward their origins as far as the evidence allows, and a little further in the direction that the evidence suggests. What I have found in that tracing is not a simple secret. Not a smoking gun document that reveals a coordinated plan to position certain families for colonial wealth at the expense of everyone else. What I have found is more interesting and more uncomfortable than that. I have found a system in which information asymmetry created advantage, in which network membership provided protection, in which prior positioning in a commercial and geographic landscape that others had not yet perceived as valuable enabled accumulation at rates that individual enterprise alone cannot explain, and in which the beneficiaries of that system had and continue to have strong reasons to prefer the mythology of individual enterprise to the reality of structural advantage. That is the answer to the mystery. And it is an answer that is more troubling than any single conspiracy because it does not have a single solution. A conspiracy can be exposed, prosecuted, dismantled. A system requires something harder. It requires honest examination of how advantage works, how it persists, how it compounds over generations, and what would be required to create a distribution of opportunity that is less determined by the accidents of birth and connection and the historical circumstances of colonial accumulation. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anyone does completely. But I know that getting to any answer requires starting from an honest account of where we are and how we got here, and the honest account of how Australian wealth got where it is starts necessarily with those early years when certain men arrived knowing more than they should have, took more than the system officially allowed, and built dynasties that Australia has been living with and around and inside of ever since. The Blue Mountains are still there. The Darling Downs are still there. The Kimberley is still there. The wool is still there, though the industry is much smaller than it once was. The land titles are still there, tracing back through company names and family trusts and inheritance chains to the original pastoral leases and the land grants of the early colonial period. The families are still there, transformed, diversified, some prominent and some quiet, but connected in ways that are real even when they are not obvious, to the original accumulation, and the Aboriginal Australians are still there, reduced in number from what they were before 1788, dispossessed of most of the country their ancestors managed for 50,000 years, living with the consequences of what happened in the pastoral expansion of the 1820s and 1830s, still fighting in courts and in communities and in the political arena for recognition of what was taken and for some measure of return, Their presence in the contemporary landscape, as in the historical record, is the most important fact. It is the fact that the mystery of the colonial fortunes ultimately resolves into. And it is the fact that the official history, with its comfortable narrative of individual enterprise and colonial initiative, has done the most to obscure. The families appeared from nowhere, but the country they took appeared from somewhere. It appeared from 50,000 years of human habitation, and understanding the mystery of one requires understanding the truth of the other. There is a particular kind of silence that descends on the Australian bush after dark. If you have been in the inland country, away from the towns, you will know what I mean. The daytime is never quiet in the bush. There are birds and insects, and the movement of animals, and the sound of wind through particular grasses and trees. But after dark, there is a quality to the silence that is different from the silence of other places. It is not empty, it is dense. It feels like a place where things are present but not moving, where attention is being paid from directions you cannot identify. The Aboriginal Australians, who know that country in ways that no European tradition of engagement with landscape quite replicates, understand that silence differently from the way a white Australian or a visitor understands it. They understand it as the presence of things, of country, of beings that are not separate from the landscape but are continuous with it, of the accumulated presence of all the people who have been in that country for tens of thousands of years, in relationships with it that were not the relationships of ownership and extraction that colonial Australia brought. I am not equipped to represent those relationships adequately, and I won't try. But I can say that spending time in the Australian inland, with any kind of openness to what it is and what it contains, produces in most people a sense that the official history, the one that starts in 1788, is inadequate to the place. That the place is older and more complex and more layered than any 200-year account can capture. That something is present in it, that the colonial narrative, with its focus on what was built and accumulated and achieved by the European settlers, simply doesn't see. The families that built their fortunes on that country, the MacArthurs and the Wentworths and the Leslies and the Duracks and all the others, were in a strange way deaf to what the country was. They saw its productive potential. They understood what it could produce in terms of wool and cattle and grain. They were, in many cases, genuinely skilled at managing the landscape for those purposes. But they did not hear what the people who were already there heard in it. They did not participate in the relationships that made the Aboriginal Australians' 50,000-year presence there possible. They imposed a different relationship, one that was, over the medium term, productive in economic terms and destructive in ecological terms, as the degradation of Australian pastoral land over the colonial and post-colonial periods demonstrates. The degradation is another part of the story that doesn't often get told alongside the wealth. The great pastoral runs that produced the founding fortunes also produced over a century and a half of European-style grazing management, a landscape that was significantly less productive than it had been when the squatters arrived. The grasses that the Aboriginal land management systems had maintained were replaced by introduced species, some productive, some not. The water systems were altered, the native animal populations were reduced in many areas drastically. The soil was damaged by hoofed stock in ways that it had not been adapted to accommodate. The land that had been kept extraordinarily productive for tens of thousands of years by human management, that understood it was under European management, that didn't understand it in the same way, degraded. This is not unique to Australia. It is the pattern of colonial pastoral expansion almost everywhere. But in Australia, it is particularly stark because the contrast is particularly sharp. The country that the squatters arrived in was not empty and degraded. It was full and managed. And the management that had maintained it was the management of the people who were displaced. The full cost of the colonial fortunes, in other words, is not just the cost to the Aboriginal Australians who were dispossessed, it is also the cost to the land itself. The land that produced the wealth was a specific kind of land that had been shaped by specific management practices over a very long time, and those practices were destroyed along with the people who practiced them. What remained was still productive, still valuable, but less so than it had been. The colonial fortunes were built on something that could not be fully replenished once the practices that maintained it were ended. There is something almost archetypal about this, something that appears again and again in the history of colonial expansion everywhere. The wealth that is extracted from a place in the first generation or two of colonial contact is produced by conditions that the colonial system itself then destroys. The fertility of the soil, the density of the game, the productivity of the fisheries, the quality of the timber, all of these can be maximized in the short term through intensive extraction, and all of them are degraded by that extraction over the medium and long term. The colonial fortunes are always, in some sense, built on borrowed time, on the spending down of a natural and cultural capital that was accumulated over centuries or millennia, and that cannot be quickly replaced. Australia is still dealing with this. The debates about land degradation, about the management of water in the Murray-Darling Basin, about the decline of native species, about the long-term productivity of Australian pastoral land, are in part the downstream consequences of decisions made in the squatting era. Decisions about how to use land that were made by people who did not understand or who did not care, about the long-term sustainability of the practices they were imposing. The families got rich, the land paid the price. The Aboriginal Australians paid a far heavier price still, and the accounting, in the full sense of that word, has never been done. So here we are at the end of a very long night. The question that started all of this about Australia's wealthiest families and why they appeared from nowhere has taken us through pre-colonial contact and maritime intelligence networks and East India Company interests and Masonic networks and Aboriginal dispossession and ecological degradation and the persistence of colonial wealth into the contemporary period. It has not produced a simple answer. It has produced a complicated one that is, I think, closer to the truth than the simple version. The families did not appear from nowhere. They appeared from somewhere, from a specific set of connections and preparations and prior knowledge that positioned certain people in the earliest years of the colony to take maximum advantage of what was available. The advantage was informational and financial and political and social, and it was maintained across generations through the mechanisms of accumulated capital, institutional connection, and the selective maintenance of a historical narrative that attributed the outcomes to individual merit rather than structural position. That is the story. Complicated, partial, still being written, but real. More real, I believe, than the version that appears in the textbooks. You have been listening for a long time. The country is out there in the dark, the inland country, the pastoral country, the country that all of this was about. Still there, still old, still waiting for a reckoning that has not yet fully come. Sleep well, and when morning comes, maybe ask a question that the official history hasn't asked. That is, in the end, all any of us can do. There is one last thing I want to say, not about the families of land or the colonial machinery, about the questions themselves, about the act of asking them. A society that cannot honestly examine its own founding is not a mature society. It is a society that is still being shaped by what it cannot bring itself to look at. Australia is old enough now and confident enough in most respects to be able to look at the colonial period with clear eyes, to ask the difficult questions, to hold the complexity of it, the genuine achievement and the genuine destruction, the individual courage and the structural violence without needing either simple heroes or simple villains. The families are part of that complexity. They were not monsters. They were people operating within a system that rewarded what they did. But the system was not neutral, and understanding that the system was not neutral, that the wealth it produced was the product of specific choices with real costs, begins honest engagement with history. Sleep well.